The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Westminster Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. After 12 years of military service, including 3 tours in Afghanistan, he never imagined he would find himself standing guard outside one of the most prestigious locations in the world. The golden buttons on his uniform gleamed as brightly as the morning light, each one polished to perfection during his pre-dawn preparation ritual. James had always been different from the other guards. While his colleagues maintained the traditional stoic expression expected of the Queen's Guard, there was something in his eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond the ceremonial duties they now performed. His fellow guards often remarked that he possessed an unusual calmness, a quality that seemed to emanate from deep within him. This tranquility wasn't born from a lack of awareness, but rather from having faced genuine danger and learned to navigate it with measured precision. The transition from active combat duty to ceremonial guard work had been more challenging than James anticipated. In Afghanistan, every moment required hypervigilance, constant assessment of threats, and split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between life and death. Here at the palace, the expectations were entirely different, yet equally demanding. The Queen's Guard were expected to remain motionless for hours, immune to distractions, weather, and the countless tourists who tried daily to provoke reactions from them. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the autumn air carried a crispness that reminded James of his childhood in the Yorkshire Dales. He had grown up in a small farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where handshake agreements still held weight, and where problems were solved through conversation rather than confrontation. These values had shaped his character long before the military refined his discipline and strategic thinking abilities. As James took his position outside the main gate, he noticed the usual gathering of early morning tourists beginning to form. Camera phones were already being raised, and he could hear the excited chatter of visitors from various countries, all eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony that would take place later in the morning. Among the crowd, he observed the typical mix of families with young children, elderly couples on holiday, and groups of international students exploring London's historic sites. The palace grounds buzzed with the controlled activity of staff members preparing for another day of official duties. Groundskeepers moved quietly across the manicured lawns, ensuring every blade of grass met the exacting standards expected of a royal residence. Security personnel in plain clothes mingled seamlessly with the gathering crowd, their trained eyes constantly scanning for anything unusual or potentially threatening. James had learned during his orientation that being a Queen's Guard required more than just standing still and looking impressive. They were the first line of defense for one of the most important buildings in the British Empire. Every guard underwent extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and specialized training that went far beyond basic military preparation. They were taught to recognize subtle signs of suspicious behavior, to assess potential threats without appearing to do so, and to respond appropriately to various scenarios while maintaining the dignity and composure expected of their position. The weight of his rifle, though unloaded according to standard ceremonial protocol, felt familiar in his hands. During his military service, his weapon had been an extension of himself, a tool that he maintained with meticulous care and respected for its potential. Now it served a largely symbolic purpose, representing the authority and protection that the crown provided to its subjects. Yet James understood that symbolism could be just as powerful as actual force when wielded correctly. As the morning progressed, the crowd outside the palace gates grew larger and more diverse. Tour guides with colorful umbrellas led groups of visitors through the historical significance of each building, statue, and ceremonial element visible from their vantage point. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, their breath creating small clouds of condensation in the cool air as they tried to get the attention of the motionless guards. James had developed a technique for managing the long hours of stationary duty. He would mentally transport himself to different places and times, reviewing memories from his childhood, recalling conversations with friends and family, or planning activities for his days off. This mental discipline helped him remain alert to his surroundings while avoiding the mind-numbing boredom that could affect guards who simply tried to think of nothing at all. During one of these mental exercises, James found himself remembering a conversation he had with his grandfather shortly before joining the military. The old man had served in World War II and had shared stories about the importance of remaining calm under pressure. His grandfather had told him that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather the ability to think clearly and act appropriately despite feeling afraid. This wisdom had served James well during combat situations, and he sensed it would prove valuable in his current role as well. The sound of approaching footsteps drew James's attention back to the present moment. A small group of tourists had moved closer to his position, and he could overhear their conversation about the guards' ability to remain motionless despite various attempts to distract them. One teenager was boasting to his friends about different tactics he had seen used to try to make guards break character, ranging from silly faces and loud noises to more elaborate pranks involving costumes and props. As James listened to their conversation, he reflected on the psychological aspect of his job. The public seemed to view the guards as living statues, challenges to be conquered, rather than human beings performing an important duty. He understood this perspective but sometimes found it troubling. Behind each uniform was a person with their own story, their own family, their own hopes and concerns. The red tunic and tall black hat didn't erase their humanity, even if it sometimes seemed to make them invisible to those who saw only the spectacle. The morning routine continued with practiced efficiency as other guards took their positions around the palace perimeter. Each man knew his role precisely and executed it with the kind of precision that only comes from extensive training and genuine commitment to excellence. The coordination required was remarkable, with timing measured in seconds and positioning calculated to ensure optimal coverage of all potential approaches to the royal residence. James had always been impressed by the teamwork demonstrated by his fellow guards. Despite the solitary nature of their individual posts, they functioned as a cohesive unit, communicating through subtle signals and maintaining constant awareness of each other's status and immediate environment. This collaboration reminded him of his military unit, where mutual trust and reliable communication had been essential for survival and mission success. The palace itself stood as a testament to centuries of British history, its architecture reflecting the evolution of royal power and the changing relationship between the monarchy and the people. James often contemplated the historical significance of his position, knowing that guards had stood in similar locations for generations, protecting the crown through wars, political upheavals, and social transformations that had reshaped the nation. As the crowd continued to grow, James noticed increased activity among the plainclothes security personnel. Their movements became more purposeful, and he observed them speaking into small communication devices with greater frequency. This heightened alertness suggested that someone of particular importance might be arriving soon, or that intelligence had indicated a potential security concern, requiring additional vigilance. The weight of responsibility that came with his position was something James took seriously. While the ceremonial aspects of his duty were important for maintaining tradition and providing an impressive display for visitors, the security function remained paramount. Every guard understood that they might be called upon to transition instantly from ceremonial duty to active protection, requiring them to maintain peak readiness at all times. His training had included scenarios involving various types of threats, from individual troublemakers seeking attention to more serious security concerns that could endanger royal family members. The guards learned to assess situations quickly, determine appropriate responses, and coordinate effectively with other security personnel when necessary. This preparation built confidence and ensured that reactions would be both swift and appropriate when real situations arose. As James stood at his post, maintaining the perfect posture and expressionless demeanor expected of his position, he remained acutely aware of everything happening around him. His peripheral vision captured the movements of every person in the crowd. His hearing detected changes in conversation tones and volume levels, and his instincts, honed through years of military experience, constantly evaluated the overall atmosphere for signs of potential trouble. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the air and encouraging even more tourists to venture out for sightseeing activities. Street vendors began setting up their stalls nearby, offering souvenirs, postcards, and refreshments to the growing number of visitors. The combination of excited tourists, busy vendors, and regular palace staff created a complex environment that required constant monitoring and assessment by the security team. James understood that his role extended beyond personal protection to include preserving the dignity and reputation of the monarchy itself. Every interaction, every response to provocation, and every demonstration of professionalism contributed to the public's perception of the royal institution. This responsibility motivated him to maintain the highest standards of conduct, even when faced with challenging or disrespectful behavior from members of the public. The sound of marching feet in the distance indicated that the changing of the guard ceremony was approaching. This daily ritual attracted hundreds of spectators and required careful coordination between multiple guard units, palace staff, and security personnel. The precision and pageantry of the ceremony served both ceremonial and practical purposes, providing an impressive display of military tradition while allowing for the systematic rotation of guard duties throughout the day. As James prepared mentally for the ceremony, he reflected on how much his life had changed since leaving active military duty. The adjustment had required patience and flexibility as he learned to channel his combat experience into a very different type of service. The skills remained relevant, but their application required adaptation to a new environment with different rules, expectations, and objectives. The growing crowd pressed closer to the palace gates, with photographers positioning themselves for optimal views of the upcoming ceremony. James could sense the anticipation building among the spectators, many of whom had traveled great distances specifically to witness this famous British tradition. Their excitement was palpable, adding energy to the atmosphere that made his job more challenging, but also more meaningful. Standing guard at one of the world's most recognizable locations brought with it a unique set of pressures and privileges. James knew that photographs of him would be shared around the world, that his image would represent not just himself, but the entire British military and the monarchy itself. This knowledge motivated him to embody the very best qualities of duty, honor, and service that the uniform represented. As the morning progressed toward the ceremonial changing of the guard, James maintained his vigilant watch over the growing crowd, unaware that the day would soon present him with a situation that would test every skill he had learned during his military career and challenge him to demonstrate the true meaning of courage under pressure. The ceremony began with the distinctive sound of military drums echoing across the palace courtyard. James remained at his post as the new guard formation approached in perfect synchronization, their red uniforms creating a striking visual display against the historic stone architecture. The crowd pressed forward, cameras clicking rapidly as tourists captured what many considered the quintessential British experience. Among the sea of faces, James noticed a man in his early 30s standing slightly apart from the main group of spectators. Unlike the excited tourists around him, this individual appeared tense and agitated. His hands moved restlessly in his jacket pockets, and his eyes darted nervously between the guards and the crowd. James's military training kicked in automatically, cataloging these behavioral anomalies while maintaining his ceremonial posture. The man wore a dark blue jacket that seemed too warm for the weather, and despite the cool morning air, perspiration was visible on his forehead. His positioning allowed him quick access to multiple exit routes, a tactical advantage that seemed deliberately chosen rather than coincidental. James filed these observations away while continuing to monitor the overall crowd dynamics and the progression of the changing ceremony. As the incoming guard formation drew closer, the crowd's excitement reached a crescendo. Children pointed eagerly at the approaching soldiers while their parents struggled to maintain control and capture perfect photographs. The noise level increased substantially, with conversations in multiple languages blending together into a constant hum of anticipation and wonder. The man James had been observing suddenly stepped forward, pushing through a family of tourists with unnecessary force. The father of the family protested the rough treatment, but the man ignored him completely and continued moving toward the front of the crowd. His urgency seemed disproportionate to the situation, raising additional concerns in James's mind. Security personnel in plain clothes had also noticed the man's behavior and began repositioning themselves strategically throughout the crowd. Their movements were subtle but purposeful, designed to maintain observation without alerting the individual to their presence. James could see the tension building among the security team as they prepared for potential intervention. The changing of the guard ceremony continued with clockwork precision, unaffected by the underlying tension that only trained security personnel could detect. The retiring guards executed their movements with the same perfect timing and coordination that had made this ceremony famous worldwide. Tourists continued photographing and filming, completely unaware of the developing situation in their midst. James found himself in a unique position, bound by ceremonial protocol to remain motionless while his instincts screamed warnings about the agitated man's intentions. The conflict between his role as a ceremonial guard and his training as a soldier created an internal tension that required careful management. He needed to be ready for action while appearing completely passive to outside observers. The suspicious individual reached into his jacket pocket with sudden determination, his hand emerging with what appeared to be a metallic object. In the crowded environment with people constantly moving and adjusting their positions, it took several crucial seconds for nearby security personnel to get a clear view of what he was holding. James's position provided him with an unobstructed sightline to the man's actions. What he saw caused his blood to run cold, while his expression remained perfectly neutral. The object in the man's hand was unmistakably a firearm, and it was being raised with clear intent toward James's position. Time seemed to slow down as James's combat experience automatically took control of his responses. His mind rapidly assessed the situation, calculating distances, evaluating threats to civilians, and determining the most appropriate course of action. The ceremony continued around him, but his focus narrowed to the immediate danger developing just meters away. The man's movements became more erratic as he struggled to get a clear shot through the dense crowd of tourists. His agitation was increasing, and James could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Innocent bystanders surrounded the gunman, creating a complex tactical environment where any sudden movement could result in civilian casualties. James's military training had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario, where split-second decisions could determine whether multiple people lived or died. The protocols he had learned emphasized the importance of remaining calm, thinking clearly, and choosing actions that would minimize harm while neutralizing threats effectively. The plainclothes security officers were moving into position, but their approach was necessarily slow and careful to avoid spooking the gunman into immediate action. James realized that he might be the only person capable of responding quickly enough to prevent a tragedy, but doing so would require him to break from his ceremonial role in full view of hundreds of witnesses and television cameras broadcasting the event worldwide. The weight of this decision pressed down on him as he maintained his motionless stance. Any action he took would be scrutinized by the media, analyzed by his superiors, and potentially criticized by those who didn't understand the full context of the situation. Yet the alternative of remaining passive while a gunman prepared to fire was unacceptable to someone who had sworn an oath to protect others. James's grandfather's words echoed in his mind about courage being the ability to think clearly under pressure. The old soldier's wisdom reminded him that doing the right thing often required personal sacrifice and the willingness to accept consequences for actions taken in service of others. The gunman's hand steadied as he prepared to fire, his finger moving toward the trigger. James could see the determination in the man's eyes and recognized the signs of someone who had moved beyond hesitation to commitment. In seconds, shots would be fired into a crowd of innocent people who had come to witness a peaceful ceremony. The ceremonial nature of James's rifle meant it contained no ammunition, making it useless as a traditional weapon, but still valuable as a tool. His strategic thinking shifted to consider alternative methods of intervention that could be effective without causing additional harm to bystanders or unnecessarily escalating the situation. The crowd remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. Their attention focused on the colorful pageantry of the changing ceremony. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for better views, while teenagers took selfies with the palace in the background. The contrast between their innocent enjoyment and the deadly threat developing among them was stark and heartbreaking. James's training had taught him to look for opportunities that others might miss, to find unconventional solutions when conventional approaches weren't viable. As he observed the gunman's positioning and the movement patterns of the surrounding crowd, he began to formulate a plan that could potentially resolve the situation without violence. The key to his emerging strategy lay in understanding human psychology and the power of unexpected responses to disrupt criminal intent. Rather than meeting aggression with aggression, James considered how a completely unexpected reaction might confuse and disorient the gunman long enough for security personnel to intervene safely. His plan required precise timing and absolute confidence in execution, as any hesitation or uncertainty could result in catastrophic consequences. James drew upon every lesson he had learned during his military career, every technique he had practiced, and every instinct he had developed through years of facing dangerous situations. The gunman raised his weapon higher, searching for a clear shot through the crowd. His frustration was becoming visible as tourists continued moving unpredictably, blocking his line of sight and forcing him to adjust his position repeatedly. This delay was providing crucial time for security forces to coordinate their response, but James knew that the man's patience would not last much longer. As the ceremony reached its climactic moment with guards executing their final synchronized movements, James made his decision. The convergence of timing, positioning, and opportunity created a brief window where decisive action could make the difference between tragedy and triumph. His choice would either save lives or cost them, and there was no way to predict the outcome with certainty. The man's finger tightened on the trigger as his aim settled on James's chest. In that instant, with cameras rolling and hundreds of witnesses watching, James Mitchell prepared to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful weapon against violence is not force, but something far more unexpected and profound. His grandfather's teachings about courage, his military training and crisis management, and his own innate understanding of human nature all came together in a moment that would be remembered and analyzed for years to come. The outcome of the next few seconds would depend entirely on James's ability to execute a plan that defied conventional wisdom and challenged everyone's expectations about how such situations should be handled. The gunman's eyes locked with James's as the final moment of decision arrived. What happened next would either validate James's faith in the power of unexpected kindness or prove that some situations can only be resolved through violence. The answer lay seconds away, hidden in the choice that a single guard would make while the world watched. In the split second before the gunman could fire, James Mitchell did something that no one expected, least of all the man holding the weapon. Instead of diving for cover, shouting a warning, or attempting to use his ceremonial rifle as a defensive tool, James slowly and deliberately smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile or one born of arrogance, but rather a genuine expression of warmth and understanding that seemed to reach across the chaos and connect with something deep inside the troubled man. The gunman's finger froze on the trigger, his face registering complete confusion at this unexpected response. In all his planning and mental preparation for this moment, he had anticipated fear, anger, or aggressive retaliation. He had never considered that his intended victim might respond with kindness and apparent compassion. The smile disarmed him more effectively than any weapon could have. James maintained eye contact with the gunman while slowly nodding his head in a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and acceptance. Without breaking his gaze or losing his gentle expression, he began to speak in a voice that was just loud enough for the man to hear over the ceremonial music and crowd noise, yet calm enough to seem like a private conversation between two individuals who had known each other for years. "I can see you're hurting," James said softly, his words carrying the weight of genuine concern rather than fear or condescension. "Whatever brought you here today, whatever pain you're carrying, I want you to know that someone sees it and understands that you're struggling with something bigger than all of this." The gunman's hand began to shake, the weapon wavering as his resolve crumbled in the face of unexpected human compassion. He had prepared himself for confrontation, for violence, for the satisfaction of striking back at a system he felt had wronged him. But James's response offered something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine human connection and acknowledgement of his suffering. James continued speaking in the same gentle tone, never breaking eye contact or allowing his expression to shift from one of sincere concern. "I've been where you are," he said, drawing upon his own experiences with trauma and recovery. "I've felt that anger that seems to burn everything else away, that makes you feel like violence is the only language anyone understands. But I'm here to tell you that there are other ways to be heard." The crowd around them continued to enjoy the ceremony, completely unaware of the life and death drama playing out in their midst. Children laughed and pointed at the guards while parents snapped photographs, their innocent joy creating a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment between James and the gunman. Security personnel had positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd, but held back from immediate intervention as they recognized that James's approach was having a profound effect on the situation. They remained ready to act if necessary, but understood that sometimes the most effective law enforcement comes through human connection rather than force. "What's your name?" James asked, his question delivered with the same warmth he might use when meeting a new neighbor. The simple inquiry humanized the interaction in a way that transformed the gunman from a threatening figure into a person with an identity, a history, and presumably people who cared about him. The man's lips moved silently for several seconds before he managed to whisper, "David." His voice cracked as he spoke his own name, as if he hadn't heard it used kindly in longer than he could remember. The gun in his hand lowered slightly, though he maintained his grip on it as his internal struggle intensified. "David," James repeated, giving the name weight and significance. "That's a good name, strong. It tells me you come from people who believed in facing giants, just like the David in the old stories. But sometimes the giants we're fighting aren't outside us. They're inside us, and they're made of pain and loneliness and feeling like nobody understands what we're going through." David's eyes filled with tears as James's words found their mark. The guard's ability to see past the weapon and the threat to the human being underneath was breaking down walls that David had spent months building around his heart. The validation of his pain was something he had desperately needed, but had given up hope of ever receiving. James recognized the signs of a person in mental crisis, someone who had reached a breaking point where destructive action seemed like the only way to make the pain stop or to force the world to acknowledge his suffering. His military experience had taught him that such individuals often responded better to compassion than to confrontation, especially when that compassion came from someone who genuinely understood trauma and its effects. "I lost 3 good friends in Afghanistan," James continued, sharing his own vulnerability to create a bridge of understanding between them. "For months after I came home, I was so angry I could barely function. Angry at the war, angry at the politicians who sent us there, angry at people here who went about their normal lives while my friends were dying thousands of miles away. I understand that rage, David. I know what it feels like when it threatens to consume everything you are." The weapon in David's hand dropped another few inches as he absorbed James's words. The idea that this composed, dignified guard had experienced similar struggles challenged David's assumption that he was alone in his pain. The possibility that someone else had found a way through the darkness began to crack open a small space of hope in his heart. James could see that his approach was working, but he also understood how precarious the situation remained. David was clearly in crisis, and people in such states could shift rapidly between different emotional extremes. Maintaining the connection while gradually de-escalating the threat would require continued patience and careful attention to David's responses. "The thing about that anger," James said, "is that it tricks us into thinking that causing pain will somehow ease our own pain. But it doesn't work that way. All it does is add more suffering to a world that already has too much. The only thing that actually helps is finding people who can see your pain and help you carry it until you're strong enough to bear it on your own." David's entire body began to shake as emotions he had suppressed for months rose to the surface. The gun in his hand became heavier as the adrenaline that had sustained his aggressive intentions began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and overwhelming sadness. James's words were reaching parts of his soul that had been crying out for acknowledgement and understanding. "I don't want to hurt anyone," David whispered, his voice barely audible above the ceremonial music. "I just wanted someone to see me, to understand that I'm drowning and I don't know how to save myself." The admission cost him tremendous effort, requiring him to acknowledge his vulnerability in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. James nodded with deep understanding, his expression conveying that David's confession was not only heard, but truly comprehended. "I see you, David. I see someone who's been carrying pain that's too heavy for one person to bear alone. And I want you to know that your life has value, not because of what you might do today, but because of who you are as a human being." The ceremonial changing of the guard continued around them, but time seemed suspended in the small space between James and David, where a profound human connection was dissolving the threat of violence through the simple power of recognition and compassion. Other guards maintained their positions while security personnel watched carefully, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something remarkable. David's grip on the weapon loosened as James's words continued to work their way into his consciousness. The guard's refusal to treat him as a monster, his insistence on seeing him as a person worthy of understanding and care, was undermining every justification David had constructed for his planned actions. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice small and uncertain like a lost child seeking direction. The question revealed his recognition that he had reached a crossroads where he could choose between destruction and the possibility of healing, between isolation and connection, between ending his pain through violence and finding a way to transform it into something meaningful. James's smile deepened as he recognized the shift in David's attitude. The man was no longer a gunman planning an attack, but rather a fellow human being reaching out for help and guidance. "Now we figure out how to get you the help you need," James said gently. "There are people trained to work with folks who are going through what you're experiencing. Good people who understand trauma and know how to help you find your way back to yourself." The transformation in David was visible to everyone watching. His shoulders sagged as the tension left his body, and the weapon in his hand pointed toward the ground rather than at any person. The crisis was de-escalating through the power of human connection and James's willingness to risk his own safety to reach out to someone in desperate need. James had demonstrated something profound about the nature of courage and the power of choosing compassion over confrontation when faced with violence. His decision to respond to aggression with understanding had not only saved lives, but had also opened the possibility of genuine healing for someone who had nearly given up hope entirely. As David slowly lowered the weapon completely, pointing it toward the ground, James took a careful step forward, while maintaining the same gentle expression that had begun this remarkable transformation. The movement was deliberate and non-threatening, designed to close the physical distance between them, while reinforcing the emotional connection they had established. "David," James said softly, "I'm going to ask you to do something that might feel scary, but I need you to trust me. Can you set the gun down on the ground and step back from it? Not because I'm afraid of you, but because I want to help you, and it's hard for people to see past that weapon to the person who needs assistance." David looked down at the gun in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. The weight of what he had almost done began to settle on him, and his face crumpled with the realization of how close he had come to destroying not only his own life but potentially the lives of innocent people around him. The weapon suddenly felt toxic in his grip, a symbol of his pain that had nearly transformed into unspeakable tragedy. With trembling hands, David slowly bent down and placed the gun on the cobblestones before stepping backward several paces. The simple act of releasing the weapon seemed to lift a tremendous burden from his shoulders, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe freely. James nodded approvingly, his smile never wavering as he acknowledged David's courage in choosing to trust rather than to harm. "That took real strength, David. I know that wasn't easy, but you just made a choice that shows the best part of who you are." The plainclothes security officers began moving in slowly, their approach careful and measured, to avoid startling David or breaking the fragile connection James had established. One officer carefully secured the weapon, while others positioned themselves to provide support if needed, but their body language remained non-threatening, following James's lead in treating David as someone in need of help rather than simply a criminal to be subdued. The ceremony continued around them, though several tourists had begun to notice the unusual activity taking place near the palace gates. Camera phones started turning in their direction, but James remained focused solely on David, understanding that the most important work was far from over, despite the immediate threat being neutralized. "David, I want you to meet some people who are here to help," James said as a crisis intervention specialist approached. The woman was dressed casually and wore an expression of professional concern mixed with genuine warmth. Her presence had been requested by security as soon as they recognized the nature of the situation developing. Dr. Sarah Collins had been working with individuals in mental health crises for over 15 years, and she immediately recognized the delicate dynamics James had created. Rather than rushing in to take control, she allowed him to continue leading the interaction, while positioning herself to provide support and expertise when needed. "Hello, David," Dr. Collins said gently, using the same warm tone that James had established. "My name is Sarah, and I work with people who are going through difficult times. James tells me you've been struggling with some heavy things, and I want you to know that what you're experiencing is more common than you might think. You're not alone in this. David looked between James and Dr. Collins, his eyes still reflecting the vulnerability and confusion of someone who had been pulled back from the brink of a terrible decision. The kindness being shown to him felt almost overwhelming after months of isolation and despair, and he found it difficult to accept that people could see past his actions to the pain that had driven them. "I almost hurt people," David whispered, the full weight of his near actions beginning to settle on him. "I came here planning to... I don't even know what I was planning exactly. I just wanted the pain to stop, and I thought maybe if I did something dramatic, something that would make people pay attention, then maybe someone would understand how much I was hurting." James and Dr. Collins exchanged a quick glance, both recognizing the classic signs of someone who had reached a crisis point, where self-destructive actions seemed like the only way to communicate unbearable internal pain. This understanding informed their approach as they worked to provide the validation and support David desperately needed. "David, what you're describing makes perfect sense," Dr. Collins said with professional compassion. "When people are in tremendous emotional pain, especially when that pain has been ignored or dismissed by others, it's natural to look for ways to make it visible. The fact that you were able to step back from that impulse when James showed you another way tells me a lot about your character and your capacity for growth." The crowd around them had begun to thin slightly as the formal ceremony concluded, but several tourists remained nearby, curious about the unusual scene playing out before them. James remained acutely aware of their presence and the potential for the situation to become a spectacle that could further traumatize David or complicate his recovery. "Can we find somewhere more private to talk?" James asked Dr. Collins, understanding that David would benefit from being away from the public eye while he processed what had just happened and began to consider his next steps. Dr. Collins nodded and gestured toward a nearby building where crisis intervention sessions could be conducted in a safe, confidential environment. "And David, would you be willing to come with us and continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable? We have a place nearby where you can take some time to decompress and figure out how you want to move forward from here." David hesitated, clearly torn between his need for help and his fear of the consequences that might await him. His eyes darted between James and Dr. Collins, seeking reassurance that their kindness was genuine and wouldn't suddenly transform into judgment or punishment once he was away from the public eye. James sensed his uncertainty and addressed it directly. "David, I want to be completely honest with you about what happens next. There will be some legal processes you'll need to work through because of what happened here today. But the people you'll be working with understand that you were in crisis, not acting with malicious intent. The focus is going to be on getting you help, not on punishment." This honesty seemed to provide David with the clarity he needed to make a decision. He nodded slowly, understanding that while there would be consequences for his actions, the path forward offered hope for healing rather than simply retribution. As they began walking toward the crisis intervention facility, James found himself reflecting on the extraordinary events of the morning. His decision to respond to aggression with compassion had not only prevented a potential tragedy, but had also demonstrated something profound about human nature and the power of unexpected kindness to transform even the most dangerous situations. Dr. Collins walked beside David, maintaining a steady stream of supportive conversation designed to keep him grounded in the present moment and focused on positive possibilities rather than shame or fear about his recent actions. Experience had taught her that the period immediately following a crisis was crucial for establishing the foundation for long-term recovery. James remained with them as they entered the building, understanding that his continued presence provided David with a sense of continuity and safety that would be important for the initial stages of his treatment. The connection they had formed during those crucial moments would serve as an anchor point David could reference as he began the difficult work of healing. The facility they entered was designed specifically for crisis intervention, with comfortable seating areas, calming colors, and an atmosphere that emphasized safety and confidentiality. David visibly relaxed as they moved away from the public space where he had nearly made an irreversible mistake. "David, before we begin talking about treatment options and next steps, I want to acknowledge something important," James said as they settled into the quiet consultation room. "What you did out there, choosing to trust us and step away from violence, that wasn't weakness. That was strength. That was you fighting for the part of yourself that wants to heal and grow. David's eyes filled with tears as he absorbed James's words. The guard's continued belief in his worth and potential felt like a lifeline thrown to someone who had been drowning in despair for far too long. For the first time in months, David began to believe that recovery might actually be possible. As Dr. Collins began the formal intake process that would connect David with ongoing mental health services, James prepared to return to his duties with a profound sense of satisfaction. He had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon against violence is not force, but rather the courage to respond to hatred with love and to meet aggression with understanding. 6 months after that extraordinary morning at Westminster Palace, James Mitchell received an unexpected letter in his personal mail. The envelope bore no return address, but the careful handwriting suggested someone who had taken great care in composing whatever message lay inside. As he opened it in the quiet of his small London apartment, he discovered a letter that would profoundly impact his understanding of the ripple effects created by choosing compassion over confrontation. The letter was from David Thompson, the man who had held a gun aimed at James's chest during what could have become a national tragedy. David's words were thoughtful and articulate, revealing an intelligence and sensitivity that had been completely obscured by his crisis state during their initial encounter. The transformation in his communication style alone spoke volumes about the healing journey he had undertaken. David wrote about the intensive therapy program he had completed following that day at the palace. He described how Dr. Collins and her team had helped him understand that his mental health crisis had been building for years, triggered by a combination of job loss, relationship breakdowns, and undiagnosed depression that had gradually isolated him from everyone who might have provided support. The letter detailed David's struggle to forgive himself for coming so close to committing an act of violence that would have destroyed multiple lives, including his own. He wrote about sleepless nights spent replaying the moments when he had stood in that crowd, weapon in hand, consumed by pain that felt infinite and insurmountable. The memory of how close he had come to crossing a line from which there would be no return continued to haunt him even as he worked toward recovery. But more than anything, David wrote about the moment when James had smiled at him instead of showing fear or anger. That simple human gesture had penetrated through months of accumulated rage and desperation to reach something deeper inside him that he had thought was lost forever. The guard's willingness to see him as a person rather than a threat had saved not only lives that day, but it also saved David's fundamental belief in his own capacity for goodness. David explained that he had spent the first several weeks after the incident struggling to understand why James had responded the way he did. In therapy sessions, he and Dr. Collins had explored the psychology of compassionate responses to aggression, discussing how James's military experience and personal character had combined to create someone capable of such an extraordinary act of courage. The letter revealed that David had been working with a local veterans organization, using his experience to help other individuals who were struggling with similar crises. His near catastrophe had become a source of insight that allowed him to connect with people who felt invisible and unheard in ways that traditional counselors sometimes couldn't reach. James learned from David's letter that news of the incident had spread through social media and news outlets, though the palace and law enforcement had worked to minimize publicity in order to protect David's privacy and avoid encouraging copycat incidents. However, the story of a royal guard who had prevented violence through kindness rather than force had resonated with people around the world who were hungry for examples of humanity triumphing over hatred. David wrote about receiving messages from strangers who had seen brief news reports about the incident and had been inspired to reconsider their own approaches to conflict resolution. Teachers wrote about using the story to discuss alternatives to violence with their students. Military personnel shared how James's example had influenced their thinking about de-escalation techniques. Mental health professionals described incorporating elements of James's approach into their crisis intervention protocols. The ripple effects of that single moment of compassion had extended far beyond what either James or David could have imagined. James read with amazement about David's description of a conference for crisis intervention specialists, where the incident had been analyzed as a case study in the power of human connection to neutralize even the most dangerous situations. Dr. Tipo. Collins had apparently written a research paper about the psychological dynamics involved in James's response, examining how his ability to maintain emotional regulation under extreme stress had created space for David's better angels to emerge. The paper had been published in a prestigious journal and was being used in training programs for law enforcement and security personnel worldwide. David's letter also included an update on his personal recovery. He had found stable employment with a non-profit organization that worked with individuals experiencing homelessness and mental health crises. His own experience with nearly losing everything had given him unique insight into the desperation that could drive people to destructive choices, while his recovery journey provided hope for others who felt trapped by their circumstances. The work had become more than just a job for David. It had become his mission to ensure that other people in crisis received the kind of compassionate intervention that had saved his life. He wrote about late-night conversations with individuals standing on metaphorical ledges, using the memory of James's smile as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, human connection remained possible. James was particularly moved by David's description of a young veteran he had worked with who was struggling with thoughts of suicide following his return from overseas deployment. David had shared his own story, emphasizing how James had chosen to see beyond the weapon to the wounded person holding it. This perspective had helped the veteran begin to see himself as someone worthy of help, rather than simply a burden on others. The letter included David's reflection on how the incident had changed his understanding of strength and weakness. Before that day, he had viewed vulnerability as something to be hidden and emotional pain as a sign of personal failure. James's willingness to show compassion to someone pointing a gun at him had demonstrated a kind of courage that David had never imagined possible. David wrote about his ongoing therapy and the ways he continued to process the trauma that had led him to such a desperate place. He acknowledged that recovery was not a linear process, and that he still experienced difficult days when the old feelings of hopelessness threatened to return. But he had developed coping strategies and support networks that helped him navigate these challenges without returning to destructive patterns. The letter concluded with David's expression of gratitude that went far beyond simple thanks for preventing a tragedy. He wrote about how James had given him back his belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity and had shown him that redemption was possible even for someone who had come so close to committing an unforgivable act. David included his contact information and an invitation for James to visit him at the nonprofit organization where he worked. He wanted to introduce James to the people whose lives had been indirectly touched by his compassion. Individuals who had benefited from David's ability to counsel others precisely because he had experienced the transformative power of unexpected kindness during his own darkest hour. As James finished reading the letter, he found himself reflecting on his grandfather's words about courage being the ability to think clearly under pressure. That morning at the palace, he had demonstrated physical courage by remaining calm in the face of immediate danger. But the letter revealed that he had also exhibited a different kind of courage, by choosing to believe in the possibility of human goodness even when confronted with its apparent absence. The story that had begun with a gun pointed at a royal guard had evolved into something far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. It had become a testament to the power of individual choices to create cascading effects that touch lives in ways we may never fully comprehend, reminding us that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can generate the most profound transformations. James carefully folded David's letter and placed it in a special box where he kept his most meaningful correspondence. He knew that this was not the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a connection that would continue to influence both their lives and the lives of countless others who would benefit from David's transformed perspective and James's example of compassionate courage. The incident at Westminster Palace had lasted only minutes, but its impact would continue reverberating through the world for years to come, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness is not force or authority, but simply the willingness to see the light that exists within every human being, even in their moments of greatest crisis and desperation.